There was a box waiting for Eleanor at the end of this journey. She did not know that yet. She only knew that the train was slowing, and that somewhere ahead, in a small stone station she had visited only a handful of times in her life, a locked room held something her aunt had kept hidden for the better part of a century, a promise made to a man who never came back, a promise her aunt had died, still keeping. Eleanor did not know his name yet either. She did not know that a single silver watch, wrapped in cloth and shelved in the dark, was about to change the whole shape of what she thought she understood about the quiet, careful woman who had raised her in all but name. She only knew that the solicitor's letter in her coat pocket said the cottage was hers now, and the garden was hers now, and the contents of both were hers now. Whatever that turned out to mean. It meant she would learn, before that first week was out. A room she had not been told existed. It meant tags in her aunt's own hand, one of them written for someone who might never come at all, though someone eventually would. It meant a story her aunt had never told a single soul in the village, not in 50 years, not once, and had chosen instead to leave folded into a box on a shelf, waiting for whoever finally thought to open it. That person was about to be Eleanor. She simply did not know it yet. The carriage was nearly empty by the time the train left the last town behind and began its slow climb into the hills. And Eleanor sat with her forehead almost touching the cold glass of the window, watching the country change the way it always changed on this line. Fields giving way to hedgerows, hedgerows giving way to the first low shoulders of moor, everything grey-green and wet, with a rain that had stopped falling an hour before, but had left its evidence on every surface, on the window itself, on the sheep in the far fields, on the slate roofs of the cottages that came and went between the trees. It felt strange to feel the train slowing for Ashwick now, actually slowing, actually meaning to stop there, and to know that this time she would step down onto that platform and not step back onto any train again that evening or the evening after, or for a good while yet. The solicitor's letter was in her coat pocket, folded into a shape that no longer matched its original folds, softened at the corners from being taken out and read and put away again more times than she could account for. She did not need to read it anymore. She knew the shape of what it said without needing the words in front of her, the way you know the shape of a piece of music after you have heard it enough times that the notes themselves become almost unnecessary, present in you before they arrive. Her aunt had left her the cottage and the garden that ran along the platform, and the contents of both, which the letter had described in the flat, legal language of such letters. Contents meaning nothing and everything, meaning a life folded into drawers and cupboards and one small unlit room she had not yet seen and did not yet know existed. She had not been close to her aunt in the way that families are sometimes close, with visits and letters and a running conversation that never quite stopped. She had been close to her in the other way, the quieter way, the way that exists between people who do not need very much, said between them to feel that something real is being carried along. Her aunt had kept the station at Ashwick for the better part of her life. Not as its official master. There had always been someone else with that title and that uniform, but as the person who kept the waiting room fire lit and the tea urn filled and the platform edges swept and the flowers along the fence in bloom in whatever season allowed it, so that anyone who stood on that platform for the 10 minutes or so it took a train to arrive would find themselves standing somewhere someone had troubled to make pleasant. It was not a job that appeared on any list of stationed employees. It was simply what her aunt had done, quietly, for a very long time. in the way that people do things that are theirs to do without anyone assigning them the doing of it. The train slowed further. The fields outside gave way to the first buildings of the village proper, a scattering of stone cottages with smoke rising thin and straight from their chimneys in the still afternoon air. A church tower, visible above a stand of bare trees. And then, coming into view the way it always came into view on this line, low and unassuming beside the track, the station itself, Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest at the sight of it. Not grief exactly, or not only grief, but something closer to recognition. The particular feeling of seeing a place that had existed inside her as a memory suddenly resolve itself back into an actual location, with actual weight and actual stone, ready to be walked into. The platform, when she stepped down onto it, smelled of coal smoke and wet stone, and, faintly beneath both of these, something sweeter that she could not immediately place, and then did place, with a small jolt, as the last of the roses along the fence, browning now and past their season, but still holding their scent in the cold air, the way flowers do at the very end of their flowering, giving up the last of themselves all at once. She stood for a moment with her case in her hand and let the train pull away behind her, the sound of it fading down the line toward the next station and the one after that, and then she was alone on the platform in the quiet that comes after a train has gone. A quiet that always seems deeper than an ordinary quiet, as though the train had been carrying some of the day's noise away with it and had left behind only what was true. A man came out of the small stone building that served as the ticket office, wiping his hands on a cloth, and introduced himself as Thomas, the man who now held the official title her aunt had never held, station master, in fact, as well as in name. And he shook her hand with the particular gentleness of someone greeting a person he does not quite know how to speak to yet, uncertain of how much sympathy to offer and how much simply to let pass in silence. He told her the cottage key was where it had always been, under the third stone along the garden wall, and that he was very sorry, and that her aunt had been, in his words, the reason people liked this station more than the trains themselves, more than anything the railway company had ever done for the place. Eleanor thanked him. She did not trust herself to say very much more than that. The cottage stood at the end of the platform garden, attached to the station buildings by a low stone wall and a gate that swung on a hinge worn smooth by years of the same hand, opening it at the same time each morning, and closing it at the same time each evening. Eleanor let herself through the gate and stood for a moment in the small garden, taking in what she could see of it in the fading afternoon light. The roses along the fence, past their best now but still holding their shape. A stand of lavender, cut back for the year. A row of something she could not identify without its leaves to guide her. All of it kept with the particular attention of someone who had tended a garden not for its own sake only, but because it stood where people passing through would see it. And the seeing of it mattered. She found the key where Thomas had said it would be, cool and slightly damp under the stone, and let herself into the cottage with the particular hesitation of someone entering a house they have inherited but never lived in, uncertain of what they are walking into, uncertain of whether the air inside will feel like grief or simply like a house. It felt, in the end, like neither, or like both, at once, in a way that did not resolve itself easily. The hall was narrow and cool and smelled of the particular mixture of wood smoke and beeswax polish that seemed to belong to houses of a certain age that have been carefully kept for a very long time, and beneath that, faint but present, The smell of her aunt herself, a soap she had always used, lavender water, something Eleanor could not have named precisely, but recognized instantly. The way you recognize a person's presence in a room before you have consciously registered any single thing that tells you they were there. She set her case down at the foot of the stairs and went through the house slowly, room by room, the way you might walk through a museum, careful not to disturb anything, though there was no one left to mind if she did. The front room held a good chair by the fire, worn into the particular shape of the person who had sat in it for years, and a small table beside it with a stack of mending and a pair of spectacles folded neatly on top, as though her aunt had simply stepped out for a moment and would be back to collect them. The kitchen was small and orderly. A row of jars on the shelf above the range, labeled in a careful hand Eleanor recognized from the few letters her aunt had sent her over the years. The same slant, the same particular way of forming certain letters that made handwriting as recognizable as a voice. There was a kettle on the range, cold now, and a teapot beside it with a cozy over it, knitted in a pattern of small squares, and Eleanor found herself standing in front of this teapot for longer than made any sense, simply looking at it, at the particular, ordinary fact of a teapot left ready for a cup of tea that had never been poured. Upstairs, the bedroom was small and plain, a bed with a patchwork quilt that had clearly been made by hand over a long stretch of time. Different fabrics from different eras of the house's life sewn together into a single whole. A washstand with a jug and basin. A wardrobe that when Eleanor opened, it held a modest number of dresses and coats, all dark, all practical, all smelling faintly of the same lavender she had noticed in the hall. She did not stay long in this room. It felt, more than any other room in the house, like a space that belonged entirely and specifically to a person who was no longer there to occupy it, and she found she needed to close the door on it for the moment and come back to it later, when she had had more time to settle into the strangeness of being here at all. She spent that first evening doing very little beyond the small tasks that seemed necessary to make the house feel inhabited again, laying a fire in the front room grate, finding candles in a kitchen drawer when she discovered the gas had been let go out, and she did not yet know how to relight it, boiling water in a pan on the range for a cup of tea. She drank sitting in her aunt's chair by the fire, telling herself this was practical and not sentimental, though she suspected it was a little of both. The house settled around her as the evening went on, the particular settling that old houses do once the fire is lit and the cold begins to be pushed back from the corners of the rooms, small ticks and creaks that she did not yet know the meaning of, but that she suspected she would come to know, the way you come to know the particular sounds of any house you live in long enough, until you can tell, without looking, whether it is the wind or the water pipes, or simply the house shifting its weight, the way old houses do when the temperature changes. She went to bed early that night, in the small back room rather than her aunt's own room, telling herself this was simply practical, that she was tired from the journey, though she suspected, again, that there was more to it than practicality, a reluctance to occupy the more intimate room of the house before she had had time to earn some sense of belonging there. She lay in the dark and listened to the house. And, beneath the house's sounds, fainter, the particular sound of the railway line itself, a stillness broken only occasionally by something she could not quite place, a settling of the rails, perhaps, or wind moving along the embankment, and once, very late, what might have been a goods train passing far down the line, a low sound, felt more than heard, there and then gone, the whole night folding back into silence around it. She woke the next morning to a grey light coming through the curtains, and, for a moment, the disorientation of waking in an unfamiliar bed before the previous day arranged itself back into place around her, and she remembered where she was and why. She lay for a little while listening to the quiet of the house and the fainter quiet of the village beyond it. A single bird, somewhere close by, the particular hush of a morning before anything much has happened in it. And then she rose and dressed and went down to the kitchen to see about breakfast, and to see, in the fuller light of morning, what kind of a place she had actually inherited. The kitchen in daylight was better than it had been by candlelight, small and neat and well organized in the particular way of a room used by someone who had cooked in it for so long that everything had found its permanent place without any need for labels or systems beyond the memory of where things went. Eleanor found bread in a crock and butter in a dish under a wire cover, and made herself breakfast with the particular carefulness of someone using another person's kitchen for the first time, unsure yet of her right to move things, to use the good knife rather than whichever knife came first to hand, to sit at the table rather than standing at the counter the way she might have done in her own kitchen, in her own life, before all of this. After breakfast, she went out into the garden properly for the first time, in full daylight, to see what her aunt had made of the small strip of ground between the cottage and the platform fence. It was, she saw now, more considered than she had understood the evening before, laid out not as a private garden exactly, but as something meant to be seen from the platform, roses along the fence, where passengers waiting for a train would have them at eye level, a bed of something that would flower brightly come spring set, where it would catch the morning sun, and therefore the morning light on anyone standing at that end of the platform. A row of herbs near the cottage door that Eleanor suspected had supplied more than one cup of tea to travellers who mentioned, in passing, a headache or a chill, and had been quietly given something for it from a woman who kept a garden of small remedies alongside her garden of simple beauty. She walked the length of the platform slowly that morning, past the ticket office where Thomas was already at work, past the waiting room with its stove not yet lit, its wooden benches worn smooth by years of passengers sitting and waiting for trains that came. On this line, at intervals generous enough to allow for real waiting, real settling into a bench with a book or a newspaper, or simply one's own thoughts. None of the rushed impatience of busier stations on busier lines. The waiting room smelled, even cold and unlit, of coal smoke absorbed into old wood over years of fires laid and relaid. And Eleanor found herself standing in the doorway of it for a long moment, imagining her aunt moving through this room each morning, laying the fire, filling the urn, setting out whatever small comforts she had decided the day called for, work that no one had asked her to do, and that she had done anyway, faithfully, for the better part of her life. In those first days she began, too, to meet the village itself, in the unhurried way that villages allow themselves to be met, not all at once but in small installments, a face at a time, a name at a time, each encounter carrying with it some fragment of her aunt, that Eleanor found herself gathering the way she was gathering the tagged items in the room she had not yet found, though she did not know that yet, without knowing she was gathering anything at all until she noticed, some evenings, how full her sense of her aunt had become simply from these small, ordinary conversations. The baker, an older woman named Sarah, who kept the single shop at the crossroads below the church, pressed a loaf into Eleanor's hands on her second morning in the village, and would not hear of payment, saying only that her aunt had brought her cuttings for her own small garden every spring for longer than Sarah could easily count, and that this loaf was simply the smallest possible beginning of a debt that could never properly be repaid in bread. She told Eleanor, standing in the doorway of the shop with the smell of that morning's baking still warm in the air behind her, that the whole village had felt the station change when Eleanor's aunt began keeping it, that before her time the platform had been a plain, functional place, adequate but nothing more, and that somewhere in the slow accumulation of years, her aunt had turned it into somewhere people spoke of fondly, somewhere they mentioned to visitors, somewhere a child growing up in Ashwick would carry with them afterward as one of the fixed, comforting images of home. The vicar, an unhurried man named Griffiths, who had held the living for longer than Eleanor's aunt had kept the station, called on Eleanor in her second week not to press any matter of faith upon her, he was careful to make clear, but simply because he had known her aunt well and felt it right to introduce himself before too much more time passed. He sat in the good chair by the fire, the chair that had been her aunt's, and Eleanor found herself watching him settle into it with a small pang, wondering whether he had sat there often enough, over the years, that the chair had come to expect him as much as it had come to expect her aunt, and he spoke, unprompted, of the particular quality of attention her aunt had brought to ordinary things, remarking that he had heard her once describe the way frost formed differently on the two sides of the platform depending on which way the wind had blown overnight, and that he had thought at the time, and thought still, that this was as good a description of a certain kind of faith as any he had preached from the pulpit. The willingness to notice, closely and without hurry, what was actually in front of you, rather than what you expected to be there. There was an older woman, too, named Constance, who lived in the last cottage before the lane gave out into open field, and who came to the station most fine mornings simply to sit on the platform bench and watch whichever train happened to be due, though she rarely, if ever, travelled on one herself. She told Eleanor, the first time they spoke, that she had been doing this since she was a young woman herself, that the habit had begun almost as a joke between her and Eleanor's aunt, two women meeting on a bench to watch trains pass, because there was, in a small village, a limited supply of entertainments, and this one cost nothing and asked nothing of you beyond a willingness to sit still and let the day arrange itself around you, and that the joke had, somewhere in the passing of years, stopped being a joke and become simply a fact of how her mornings were shaped. And she supposed, she said, looking at Eleanor with an expression that was not quite a question but invited one all the same, that she would go on sitting there whether or not there was still a friend on the platform to nod to when the train came through, because a habit that old does not need a friend attached to it to keep going, though it is considerably sweeter with one. Eleanor found herself, over these first encounters, developing a fuller sense of her aunt than she had carried with her on the train into the village, a sense built not from any single dramatic revelation, but from the patient accumulation of small remembered kindnesses, a cutting of lavender given here, a quiet word of comfort given there, an unhurried willingness to notice frost and roses, and the particular sound of a delayed train's whistle carrying differently on a damp evening than on a dry one, and she began to understand, gradually, that the room she had not yet found, the tagged items she had not yet discovered, would not be introducing her to a stranger's peculiar habit so much as confirming, in physical form, a portrait that the village itself had already begun sketching for her. Stroke by patient stroke, cup of tea by cup of tea. It was Thomas who mentioned the room at the back, almost in passing. When Eleanor asked him where her aunt had kept things, spare linens for the waiting room benches, replacement wicks for the lamps, whatever small stock a station of this kind required to keep itself running, he told her there was a room behind the ticket office, access through a door she might not have noticed, that had for as long as he had known the station served as the lost property store, and that her aunt had been the one who kept it, who logged what came in and what, occasionally, was claimed, and who had, over the years, he understood, extended her keeping of it well beyond what the position strictly required. Eleanor asked what he meant by that, and Thomas seemed for a moment uncertain how to answer, as though he were reaching for a description of something he had never quite put into words before, and then he said only that her aunt had cared about the room in a way that went past simple duty, that she had spoken of it sometimes, of certain items in particular, in a tone he associated more with a person discussing old friends than old property, and that he thought, though he could not be certain, that Eleanor might want to see it for herself before she decided what ought to be done with any of it. She found the door that afternoon, exactly where Thomas had said it would be, set into the wall behind the ticket office in a recess she would certainly have walked past without a second glance, had she not known to look for it, a plain wooden door with a lock that took the same key that had opened the cottage, as though her aunt had long ago decided that both spaces belonged, in some essential way, to the same private ownership, whatever the railway company's official paperwork might say about who owned what. The room beyond the door was smaller than she had expected, and dimmer, lit only by a single high window that let in a narrow bar of grey afternoon light, and it took her eyes a moment to adjust to what the room actually held, which was not, as she had vaguely pictured, a jumble of forgotten umbrellas and misplaced gloves, but something far more ordered, shelves along every wall, each holding a modest number of items, each item wrapped or boxed or simply set upright in its allotted space, and each, she saw as she came closer, bearing a small paper tag tied on with string, the same careful handwriting she had seen on the jam jars in the kitchen, describing, in a few brief words, what the item was, and beneath that, in a slightly different ink, as though added later, a date she could not quite bring herself to read as a date, a season, instead, a year folded into the general shape of a year, rather than a number that meant anything specific to her. And beneath that again, sometimes, a further note, a line or two, a small fragment of context that made the item into something more than simply an item. She lifted the nearest box down from its shelf and opened it to find, inside, a single glove, a woman's glove, fine leather gone soft with age, and the tag tied to its wrist, red only, left behind by the young woman on the early train. The spring the orchard came down. Eleanor stood holding this glove for a long moment, turning the tag over in her fingers as though there might be more written on the back of it, though there was not, only the same careful hand, the same brevity, a whole story folded into a single line and left, deliberately or not, at exactly that length, enough to know that something had happened here once, not enough to know what. She worked through the room slowly that first afternoon, not systematically, simply drifting from shelf to shelf, lifting down whatever caught her attention and reading its tag before setting it carefully back in its place. and with each item she found herself understanding a little more of what Thomas had meant, that her aunt's keeping of this room had gone well past the ordinary duty of logging lost property against the chance of its being reclaimed. These were not simply items awaiting owners. Some of them, she suspected, looking at the dust that had settled evenly over boxes clearly untouched for a very long stretch of years, had long ago passed the point where anyone was coming back for them, and yet they remained, kept, tagged, given their small, brief note of context, as though the keeping of the object had become, somewhere along the way, more important than the returning of it. A child's wooden toy, painted once and worn now to bare wood along its edges, tagged only. The boy who cried on the platform the autumn, the bridge, was mended and left it in his hurry to be comforted. A folded newspaper, brittle now, tagged, read by the same gentleman every Thursday for the better part of a year, and then not again. A single button, tagged in a hand that seemed, from its slightly less steady formation, to belong to an earlier and perhaps younger version of her aunt's writing than the other tags around it, fell from the coat of the man who asked after the roses, and never came back to say whether they had done well. A small tin whistle, dented along one side, tagged, belonging to the girl who played it badly and beautifully on the platform bench, waiting for her father's train every evening for a whole summer, until the evenings turned early and she stopped coming. And I have wondered since whether her father's work simply ended or something less easily explained. A pair of spectacles, one lens cracked through in a fine spidering line, tagged, worn by the old scholar who came each week to catch the slow train to the town with the good library, and who told me once that he read better on a moving train than in any chair he owned, because the movement kept his mind from settling too heavily on any single thought. A woman's shawl, the wool gone soft and slightly moth-marked at one corner, tagged, left by the young widow who sat wrapped in it on the coldest bench through a whole hard winter, saying she preferred the cold outside to the warm indoors, because indoors, she said, everything reminded her, and outdoors, at least, there was the honest business of the weather to attend to instead. A small brass compass, its needle still faintly trembling when Eleanor turned the case in her hand, tagged, carried by the young man who was certain, quite certain, that this line would one day be extended west over the moor, though nobody else believed him, and who left this behind, I think, on purpose, as a kind of promise to himself that he would return to collect it once he had proven his certainty right, though he has not yet returned, and I do not know whether this means his certainty was wrong, or simply that proving such things takes longer than a young man expects it to. A single child's shoe, its partner never recovered, tagged only with the words, "One is sometimes all that is left of a matching pair, and that is no reason not to keep it carefully." Eleanor found, the further she worked into the room, that the items grew steadily less ordinary, the further back into the shelves she reached, as though the earliest years of her aunt's keeping of this place had produced a more concentrated, more considered strangeness than the later years had, or perhaps simply that her aunt's hand, still finding its way into the habit of tagging and keeping, had allowed itself more room in those early years for a fuller line of explanation, a fuller admission of not knowing, of wondering, of caring rather more than the simple duty of lost property strictly required. She found a small carved bird, worn smooth along its back, as though it had been carried in someone's pocket, and turned over and over by an anxious thumb for years before ever coming to rest on this platform. Tagged only, left in the waiting room by someone who did not stay long enough for me to learn their name, though I would have liked to. She found a ribbon, faded now to a color that gave no clue as to what it had once been, tagged, worn in the hair of the bride, who came through on the noon train the summer. The church roof was mended, radiant. Though I never learned whether the marriage itself proved as fine as the ribbon, she began, without quite deciding to, keeping a small list of her own. In a plain notebook she found in the cottage desk, not tags exactly, but a running record of which items she had looked at and what she had learned from each. Telling herself this was simply practical, a way of keeping track of a room whose full contents she had not yet catalogued, though she suspected, even as she wrote the first entries, that the list was becoming something closer to what her aunt's daybooks had been from their very first uncertain pages. A private record of a private keeping, begun almost accidentally and likely. She was beginning to understand, to grow into something she had not quite intended when she first sat down with pen in hand. Eleanor sat down on the single wooden chair in the corner of the room, the button still in her open palm, and found that she was, without quite deciding to be, close to tears, not from any specific grief attached to any specific item, but from the accumulated weight of all of them together. The sense of a person who had spent the greater part of her life standing on one small platform in one small village, watching people pass through for the length of a train stopping and no longer, and had decided, apparently without any prompting beyond her own attention, that these passages deserved to be remembered somehow, that a glove or a button or a folded newspaper carried within it the trace of an actual human moment, brief and unrepeatable, and that someone ought to keep that trace rather than simply discard it once its window for reclaiming had closed. She did not finish going through the room that first day. There was, she came to understand over the following days, far more of it than she had first appreciated. The shelves running further back into the room than the single high window's light reached, requiring a lamp to see properly into the furthest corners. And she found herself returning to the room again and again over that first week, a little each day, partly because the task itself demanded time and care, and partly, she admitted to herself eventually, because she had begun to look forward to it, to the particular quiet absorption of lifting down another box, reading another tag, understanding a little more of the shape of a life she had known only distantly while it was being lived. On a quiet afternoon toward the end of that first week, with no train due for some hours, and the ticket office left in Thomas's capable keeping, Eleanor walked up the lane to the churchyard where her aunt had been laid. In the plain, unhurried way, the whole village seemed to do everything without any of the rushed formality she associated with such places in the town she had come from. The grave was marked simply, a modest stone with her aunt's name and the 2 dates that bracketed a life. Eleanor was only now beginning to understand the fullness of, and someone, she noted with a small, unexpected warmth, had left a fresh cutting of rosemary against the base of the stone, though she did not yet know who, and would not learn for some while yet that it had been Constance, walking up from her cottage most weeks with whatever the garden allowed, in the same unbroken habit that had once brought her to a station bench to watch trains with a friend. Eleanor stood for a long while in the cold afternoon light, the churchyard quiet around her, but for the wind moving through the yews that bordered it, and found that she did not have very much to say, not aloud, and not silently either. Only a kind of settled presence, the sense of standing near someone, rather than visiting an absence, which she had not expected, and which she was grateful for, all the same. She thought about the room behind the ticket office, about the daybook stacked in the cottage desk, about the whole, quiet, patient architecture her aunt had built across a lifetime out of nothing more than attention and small kindnesses repeated faithfully, and she thought that this, more than the stone itself, was probably the truer marker of the life that had been lived here, spread out across a platform and a garden and a room full of gloves and buttons and one small carved bird, rather than gathered into a single carved inscription in a churchyard. She walked back down the lane as the light began to go, past cottages with their windows lighting one by one against the early dusk, past the baker's shop with its shutters already closed for the evening, and arrived back at the station just as Thomas was locking the ticket office for the night, and he asked, with the particular gentleness he seemed to extend to her without ever making a show of it, whether she had found what she had gone looking for, and Eleanor said that she thought she had found something, though she was not entirely sure yet what to call it, and Thomas said only that this sounded, to him, like exactly the right kind of answer to be carrying home from a churchyard, and left it at that. The tasks of the platform had, by this point, settled into something closer to a proper routine than the occasional impulse of her first days, and Eleanor found herself rising most mornings before the first train was due, well before Thomas himself arrived to open the ticket office, and going about the small business of preparing the waiting room the way she imagined her aunt must have done for so many years before her, raking out the previous evening's ash, laying a new fire with the particular care that made the difference between a fire that caught easily and one that sulked and smoked and disappointed anyone hoping to warm their hands by it, filling the urn from the tap behind the ticket office and setting it to heat, so that by the time the first passengers arrived, shivering in the cold morning air, there would be a fire already drawing nicely, and, not long after, tea ready to be poured for anyone who wanted it, offered freely, the way her aunt had apparently always offered it, without any thought of payment beyond the simple pleasure of having made someone's wait a little more bearable. She found, doing this, a satisfaction she had not expected. Not the satisfaction of accomplishment exactly. There was nothing very difficult in laying a fire or filling an urn, but something quieter and steadier than that. The satisfaction of a task performed for its own sake, without any larger ambition attached to it, simply because it needed doing, and she had found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, to be the person now positioned to do it. She began to notice, too, the particular rhythms of the platform through a full week cycle, which mornings brought the schoolchildren waiting in a loose, chattering group for the branch connection that would take them to the town with the larger school, which evenings brought the same small handful of working men returning home with the particular tiredness of a long day behind them, glad of the fire and gladder still. Several of them admitted with a shy sort of gratitude of not having to ask for it, since it was already lit and waiting when they arrived. It was on one of these later visits, several days into her time at the cottage, that she found, tucked behind a row of ordinary boxes on one of the lower shelves, a stack of small bound books, plain covered, the kind sold cheaply in any stationer's shop for the purpose of keeping accounts or diaries, and she drew the first of them out and opened it to find, in the same familiar hand, not tags this time, but longer entries, a line or two for each day, describing not lost property specifically, but the ordinary business of the station and the platform and the garden, the weather, the trains, the small kindnesses done and small oddities noticed, a record that ran, she understood, as she turned the pages, not for weeks or months, but for years. Book after book of it, stacked here behind the boxes, as though her aunt had wanted them close to the room they described, but had not wanted them quite so visible as the tagged items themselves, a private record beside a semi-public one. She carried the first of these books out into the better light of the ticket office, where Thomas glanced up from his own work and asked, gently, whether she had found what he thought she might find eventually. And when she showed him the book, he nodded slowly and said only that he had known the books existed, had seen her aunt writing in them some evenings after the last train had gone, but had never asked to read them, feeling it was not his place, and that he supposed now it was entirely Eleanor's place, if she wanted it. She took the book back to the cottage that evening and sat by the fire with it, and began, slowly, to read. The earliest entries were spare, a few words each, weather and trains and little else. The writing of someone still finding her way into the habit of keeping a record at all, uncertain yet of what such a record was even for. But as the book went on, the entries lengthened, gained texture, began to include not simply what had happened on the platform each day, but small reflections on it, a gentleness of observation that Eleanor recognized, with a small ache, as entirely her aunt's own manner of seeing things, patient, unhurried, willing to find something worth setting down in even the smallest of ordinary occurrences. A woman waiting for a delayed train who fell into conversation with a stranger and seemed, by the time the train arrived, reluctant to end it. A boy who came every week to watch the trains simply for the pleasure of watching them, never once traveling on one. A heavy frost that silvered the whole platform overnight and made even the ordinary act of sweeping it feel, her aunt had written, like sweeping something briefly and unrepeatably beautiful into the gutter. She read on, further into that first book than she had intended to when she sat down, the fire keeping her company while the light outside failed entirely, and the window went from grey to a black, so complete it might as well have been a wall. Her aunt had written, one autumn, of a fox that had taken to crossing the line each evening at almost exactly the same moment, so reliably that Thomas's predecessor had begun to set his watch by it, half joking, though he swore afterward that the fox kept better time than the watch itself ever had. She had written of a winter so hard that the water in the waiting-room jug froze solid overnight, and of how she had found this, on waking, not an inconvenience so much as a fact, worth setting down, a small proof of how thoroughly the cold could take hold of even the warmest-kept rooms if a fire were let die even for a single night. She had written of a spring when the swallows returned earlier than anyone could remember them returning, and had taken this, in her own words, as a good omen for the year, though she was careful to add beneath it that she did not really believe in omens, only in noticing patterns and letting herself enjoy the noticing, whatever that noticing might or might not predict. There were entries, too, that dealt less with weather and wildlife than with the passengers themselves, brief character studies set down, with the same patient attention Eleanor had begun to recognize as her aunt's particular gift. An elderly gentleman who traveled the same short journey every week for reasons he never explained and she never asked after. A young mother who wept quietly on the platform one morning and was given tea and a seat by the stove. and nothing whatsoever in the way of questions. Because her aunt had written, "Some sorrows want company, and some want only privacy, and it is a kindness to learn quickly which is which." There was an entry, shorter than most, that read only, "A very small kindness offered today, hardly worth setting down, and yet I find I want to set it down anyway, because I have come to believe that the smallest kindnesses are the ones most likely to be forgotten if no one troubles to remember them. And someone ought to trouble." Eleanor found herself pausing over this particular line for a long while, turning it over the way she had turned over the tags in the lost property room, feeling that it said something not only about the platform and its passengers, but about the whole project her aunt had quietly undertaken. Across the whole span of these books and that room together, a lifelong argument, unspoken and unpreached, that the small and the ordinary deserved exactly the same careful attention, that grander occasions were more naturally given, that a glove left on a bench was as worth tagging and keeping as a wedding, that a fox crossing a line at the same hour each evening was as worth recording as any larger event the wider world might consider more significant. She read until the fire burned low, and the candle beside her had shortened considerably, and when she finally set the book down and climbed the stairs to bed, she carried with her a feeling she had not expected to have, not simply grief, though grief was certainly present in it, but something closer to company. The sense of having spent an evening in her aunt's presence after all, listening to her aunt's voice, describing her aunt's days in her aunt's own unhurried words. And she fell asleep that night, more easily than she had on any of the nights before it, the house around her settling into its familiar small sounds, the line beyond it quiet, the whole village folded into the same soft dark that had folded over it for as many years as her aunt had kept that platform garden growing. She woke the next morning with the clear sense, arriving before she had even fully opened her eyes, that she was not going to leave Ashwick as soon as she had first imagined she might. She had come, when the solicitor's letter first reached her, with some vague plan of settling the estate as efficiently as such things could be settled, deciding what to keep and what to sell and what to give away, and returning to her own life within a matter of weeks. That plan felt, this morning, less like a plan and more like a shape she had drawn, without yet knowing the actual territory it was meant to describe. And the actual territory, she was beginning to understand, was considerably larger and considerably more absorbing than she had allowed for. She spent that morning, and several mornings after it, dividing her time between the lost property room and the stack of daybooks, working through both with the same slow attention, not trying to hurry toward any particular conclusion, but simply letting herself become familiar with the shape of what her aunt had kept and why. She began, too, almost without deciding to take on some of the small tasks of the platform herself, lighting the waiting room stove of a cold morning before the first train, though no one had asked her to, filling the urn, sweeping the platform edge. And she noticed, doing these things, a certain rightness in them that surprised her, a sense of stepping into a set of motions that fit her better than she would have predicted, as though some capacity for this particular kind of quiet, unglamorous, faithfully repeated care had been waiting in her all along for the right place to be exercised. It was Thomas who noticed it first, or at least who was the first to say anything about it, remarking one morning, as she came through with the coal scuttle for the waiting room stove, that she was, in her movements if not yet in her manner, beginning to look rather like her aunt had looked doing the very same task. And Eleanor had laughed, a little startled and said she supposed there were only so many ways to lay a fire. But she had felt the remark settle into her somewhere deeper than she let on, a small confirmation of something she had not yet put into words even to herself. The days settled into a rhythm over that first stretch of weeks, the trains coming and going at their generous intervals, the light changing slowly as the season turned further toward the cold end of the year, the garden along the fence losing its last color and going over to the bare, patient shapes of winter. And Eleanor found herself more and more at home in a way she had not expected to arrive at so quickly. Or perhaps not quickly at all. Perhaps she had simply not noticed the arriving of it until it had already, in its quiet way, happened. She had not yet worked all the way through the lost property room, nor through the full stack of daybooks, which ran back further than she had first realized, volume after volume of her aunt's small, careful hand, describing years upon years of a platform she was only now beginning to know as well as her aunt had known it. But she had found, tucked among the earliest of the tagged items, near the very back of the room, where the dust lay thickest and the light from the high window barely reached at all, one box that she had not yet allowed herself to open, though she had lifted it down from its shelf and set it on the table more than once, turning its tag over in her fingers, reading the few brief words written there, and setting it back down again unopened, not from any lack of curiosity, but from a growing sense that this particular item, whatever it turned out to be, deserved a kind of attention she was not yet ready to give it. An unhurried evening, a good fire. The whole of the story it seemed to promise laid out before her, rather than glimpsed at, in the busy middle of an ordinary day. The tag on this box read simply, "Kept for the one who will come asking someday, though I do not know when." And beneath it, in ink that looked older than most of the tags around it, older even than some of the earliest daybook entries Eleanor had read, a single further line that she had read now perhaps a dozen times without feeling any closer to understanding it. Though each time she read it, she felt something in her settle a little more firmly around the sense that this, whatever it was going to matter more than the gloves and buttons and folded newspapers that filled the rest of the room, however dear those had already become to her in their own small ways. The line read, "For whoever finds this after me, know that I kept it because someone once needed it kept. And that is reason enough, and will go on being reason enough long after I am not here to explain it further." She had mentioned the box to no one, not to Thomas, not to Constance, not even in the pages of her own small notebook, where she had otherwise been careful to record almost everything else she found. It felt, somehow, too early to speak of it, as though speaking of it before she had opened it would be a kind of trespass against whatever it actually contained, a presumption she was not yet entitled to make. She had taken to setting it on the kitchen table some evenings simply to sit with its presence a while before returning it, unopened, to its shelf, and she noticed that she had begun, without quite admitting it to herself, to treat these evenings with the box the way she imagined a person might treat a letter they knew contained news they were not yet braced to receive, turning it over, weighing it, postponing the moment of breaking the seal not from indifference, but from a kind of respect for how much that moment was likely to matter once it came. She thought, some nights, that she understood already, in a general sort of way, what the box was likely to hold, given the line written beneath its tag, "Kept for the one who will come asking someday, though I do not know when." a phrasing that suggested her aunt had been keeping this item not for an owner in the ordinary lost property sense, but for someone specific, someone she had expected, someone whose eventual arrival she had been prepared to wait for across however many years it took. Eleanor did not yet know whether she herself was meant to be that someone, whether her aunt had, in some private corner of her thinking, imagined her own niece arriving one day and finding this box and understanding, at last, whatever it was there to explain, or whether the box was meant for some other visitor entirely, a stranger who might yet walk onto this platform one ordinary afternoon and ask, in words Eleanor could not yet imagine, for something that had been waiting, patiently, on a shelf in the dark, for longer than she had been alive to wonder about it. She found she did not mind, particularly, not knowing yet which of these was true. There was a kind of grace, she was discovering, in a mystery that did not need immediate solving. The same grace she had found in the daybooks and the tagged gloves and buttons, a willingness to let a thing be only partly known for a while, trusting that the rest of the knowing would arrive when it arrived, in its own unhurried time, the way trains arrived on this line, not always when you might wish them to, but reliably, eventually, exactly when the timetable, however slow and generous its intervals, said they would. Eleanor sat with the box unopened on the table before her, the fire in the waiting room grate burning low behind her, the last train of the day already come and gone, the platform beyond the window settling into the particular hush of a station at the end of its working day. And she found that she was, for the moment, entirely content to leave the box exactly as it was a little longer, to let the wondering about it sit alongside the knowing she had already gathered, rather than rushing to resolve one into the other. There would be time. She understood this now in a way she had not understood it. On the day she had first stepped down onto this platform with her case in her hand and the solicitor's letter folded soft in her pocket. She was not passing through Ashwick, the way the passengers in the daybooks passed through it. Briefly, memorably perhaps, but briefly all the same. She had, without quite deciding to, become someone who stayed. And staying, she was beginning to understand, meant that the box could wait for its evening, and the daybooks could wait for their reading, and the garden could wait for its spring, and all of it, every unfinished thread of her aunt's long keeping of this place, could simply be trusted to still be there when she was ready for it, the way a station itself simply waits, patient and lit and warm, for whichever train is next scheduled to arrive. She banked the fire for the night, checked that the lamp in the ticket office was properly out, and walked back along the platform to the cottage through air that had gone properly cold now, her breath showing in front of her, the stars beginning to come out clear and hard above the dark shape of the hills beyond the village, and she let herself in through the low gate and across the small garden and into the house that was. She understood now, without any of the strangeness that had accompanied the thought on her first night here. Simply her house, for as long as she chose to keep it, and she went up to the bedroom that had been her aunt's, and that she had, in these last few days, without any particular ceremony, begun to think of as her own. And she lay down in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, and, beyond it, faint and familiar now, in a way it had not been on that first strange night, the quiet of the line, waiting, as it always waited, for whatever the next morning's first train would bring. She thought, drifting towards sleep, of the whole quiet architecture of it. The fire laid each morning without anyone asking. The urn filled, the garden tended for eyes that would only ever glimpse it for the length of a stopping train. The gloves and buttons and folded newspapers kept faithfully on their shelves long after any reasonable hope of reclaiming had passed. The daybooks filling steadily with weather and foxes and small unremarked kindnesses, and she understood, in the loosening, unguarded way, that understanding sometimes arrives just before sleep takes a person fully, that none of it had ever required an audience to be worth doing, that her aunt had simply gone on doing it, year upon year, because the doing of it was, in itself, sufficient reason, and that she herself was beginning, gently and without any dramatic turning point she could point to afterward, to understand that reason from the inside, the way you come to understand a piece of music not by being told what it means, but by playing it yourself, slowly, one patient note at a time, until the meaning is simply there in your hands, needing no further explanation at all. She opened the box, in the end, on an evening she had not planned in advance, a Sunday, when the last train had gone earlier than usual, and Thomas had already locked the ticket office and gone home to his own fire, and the whole platform had settled into the particular deep quiet that Sundays brought to it. Fewer passengers, longer gaps between one train and the next, the whole village folding itself early into its evening rest. Eleanor had carried the box to the cottage that afternoon, meaning, as she had meant several times before, simply to sit with it a while and return it unopened. But something in the quality of that particular evening, the fire drawing well, the wind quiet outside, a sense of the whole week settled and complete behind her, told her that this was, at last, the evening the box had been waiting for. She untied the string carefully, setting the tag aside where she could still see its 2 lines of writing, kept for the one who will come asking someday, though I do not know when, and beneath it, know that I kept it because someone once needed it kept, and that is reason enough, and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a square of soft cloth, gone yellow with age, she found a pocket watch, plain silver, its case worn smooth along one edge, as though it had spent years riding in someone's waistcoat pocket against the movement of a body walking. And beneath the watch, tied with the same faded ribbon she had seen on other items in the room, a small bundle of letters, the paper thin and soft with handling, the ink browned but still perfectly legible, addressed in a hand Eleanor did not recognize, a young man's hand, she thought, looking at it, less careful than her aunt's, quicker, the letters formed with the particular urgency of someone writing between other, more pressing occupations. She opened the watch first, finding inside its case, engraved in small worn letters she had to angle toward the firelight to read clearly, a name, and beneath the name, a date rendered not as numerals, but spelled fully out in the manner of an earlier custom. And beneath that again, a short inscription she read several times before its meaning settled properly into her. To my son, that he may always know the hour to come home. She turned the watch over in her palm, feeling the worn place along its edge, where a thumb, she supposed, had rubbed the same small patch smooth over years of being carried, and she found herself wondering, holding it, about the father who had given it, about whatever quiet ceremony of departure had accompanied its passing from one generation to the next, a father's hope folded into an object small enough to fit in a waistcoat pocket, meant to measure nothing more than the ordinary hours of an ordinary life, and finding itself instead entrusted with a rather larger burden than any watch is built to carry, the marking of a promised return that never came. She set the watch down carefully on the cloth and turned to the letters. And it was in reading these, slowly, one at a time, by the light of the fire, that she began to understand the shape of the story the box had been waiting all these years to tell. The letters were from a young man named Edward, and they were addressed, each one, to her aunt, though not to the aunt Eleanor had known, not the older woman with the careful hand and the patient garden, but to a much younger version of her, a girl Eleanor had never met and could barely picture. And the letters themselves, once Eleanor had worked out their rough order from the dates written at the top of each, told a story that unfolded across what must have been the better part of a year. A courtship carried out largely at this very station, on this very platform, between a young woman who kept the waiting room even then, though only newly, still finding her way into the habit of it, and a young man who travelled through Ashwick regularly enough. In the course of some work, Eleanor could not quite piece together from the letters alone that the two of them had fallen into the easy, repeated acquaintance that so often, in villages of this size, ripens slowly into something more particular. The early letters were light, almost teasing, full of small remembered details from their brief platform conversations. A joke about the state of the tea urn, a remark about a particular hat she had worn one cold morning, a question about whether the roses along the fence had been her idea or the previous station master's. And Eleanor found herself smiling, reading these, at the clear, easy warmth between two young people who had not yet admitted to themselves or each other quite how much they had come to look forward to these brief exchanges. One letter described, at some length and with evident delight, an afternoon when a delay on the line had stranded Edward at the station for the better part of several hours he had clearly not minded in the least, writing that he had sat in the waiting room the whole while, watching her move between the stove and the urn and the small tasks of the platform, and had thought, he wrote, only half in jest, that he had never before understood how a person could make the simple business of keeping a room warm look like an art rather than a chore, and that he suspected he would from now on find every other waiting room in the country a rather poorer, colder place by comparison. Another letter recalled a shared joke about Constance, though he did not name her so plainly, referring only to the woman on the bench who watches every train as though she expects one of them, someday, to bring her something in particular, and Edward had written that he hoped, whatever it was she was waiting for, it arrived for her eventually, because a person who watched so faithfully deserved, in his view, to have that faithfulness rewarded sooner or later. The later letters grew steadily more open, more direct. Edward writing of counting the days until his work brought him back through Ashwick again, of a particular conversation they had had about the sea, which her aunt had apparently never seen, and which he had promised, in more than one letter, to show her himself one day, describing in some detail a stretch of coast he had known as a boy, the particular grey-green colour of the water on an overcast morning, the sound it made against the shingle, a sound, he wrote, he thought she would love more than almost anything, being a woman who already loved the small, unremarkable sounds of an ordinary morning, more than most people managed to notice at all. He wrote, too, of a plan, never quite stated outright but clearly present beneath the surface of several letters, that this brief station platform courtship might, given time, become something a good deal more permanent, mentioning, in one letter, a cottage he had seen for sale, not far from that same stretch of coast. Mentioning it, he was careful to write only as an idle observation and nothing more. Though the carefulness of the disclaimer told Eleanor, reading it now with the whole sad shape of the story already known to her, exactly how much more than idle the observation had actually been. And then the letters changed in character entirely, the handwriting growing quicker, less careful, the tone graver. And Eleanor understood, reading these last few, that Edward had been called away to some larger duty, a war Eleanor could place. From the details scattered through the letters, roughly enough in time, though she was careful, reading, not to reduce it to a date in her own mind, only to a season, a hard winter followed by an uncertain spring, in which a great many young men from villages, very much like this one, had been called away from platforms, very much like this one, promising, as Edward promised in his last two letters, to write again as soon as he was able, and to come back, when it was over, to collect the watch his own father had given him, which he had left with her for safekeeping. He wrote only half joking, so that he would have a reason, beyond her own dear self, to be certain of returning to Ashwick. When it was all done, there was no third letter of that final kind. The bundle ended there, and Eleanor understood, without needing it spelled out any more plainly than the box's tags had already spelled it, that Edward had not come back to collect his watch, that whatever had happened to him in that hard winter and uncertain spring had happened in the way it happened to so many young men of that generation, quietly, distantly, communicated to those who waited for them, not through any return, but through an absence that stretched on long enough to become, eventually, its own kind of answer. She sat for a long while, with the watch in her hand, feeling its worn silver case, imagining her aunt so much younger than Eleanor had ever known her to be, standing on this same platform, keeping this same watch safe against a return that never came. And she understood, more fully now than she had understood anything else in her time at Ashwick, so far, why the tag on this box had been written in the particular tone it carried, kept for the one who will come asking some day, though I do not know when. Not lost property in the ordinary sense at all, but a private vigil kept in the form of an object, a promise held open on a shelf, for however many years it took, for anyone at all, whoever they might eventually turn out to be, to come and ask about a man named Edward who had once meant to return to this platform and had not been able to. She found, tucked into the very bottom of the box, beneath the folded cloth, one further thing she had not noticed at first, a single sheet of paper in her aunt's own familiar hand, not a tag this time, but something closer to a full page, and she drew it out and read it by the firelight, understanding as she read that it was not addressed to Edward, nor to any lost property claimant, but to whoever, at whatever point in the future, finally opened this box, which was to say, she realized with a small tightening in her chest, to her. The page read, in her aunt's careful hand, that she had kept the watch and the letters not out of any inability to move forward with her own life, which she wished whoever read this to understand had been full and good, and entirely her own choosing in every particular that mattered. But because she had come to believe, over the long years of keeping this platform, that some things are owed a keeping regardless of whether they are ever reclaimed, that Edward's watch deserved to remain in careful hands, even though the hands he had meant to return it to, his own, would never again be able to hold it, and that she had decided, quite early on, that the keeping itself was the point, not the reclaiming, that a promise kept faithfully for its own sake, with no guarantee and no expectation of any resolution at all, was still a promise worth keeping. She had written further down the page that she did not know. Writing this, who would eventually open the box, whether it would be some distant relation of Edward's own family, tracing him at last through whatever records survived that hard season, or whether it would simply be whoever came after her at this station, a stranger to the story entirely, and that either way, she hoped they would understand that she was not asking them to solve anything or resolve anything, only to go on keeping the watch a little longer, in whatever way felt right to them, until such time, if such time ever came, as someone arrived who could rightly be said to be the one who had come asking. Eleanor sat with this page a long while after she had finished reading it. The fire burned low now, the cottage entirely quiet around her, and she felt, more clearly than she had felt anything since arriving at Ashwick, the full weight and full grace of what her aunt had spent a lifetime doing. Not simply tending a garden or lighting a fire or logging lost umbrellas, but keeping faith in the most literal sense, with a single unfinished story that had touched her own life once, briefly and permanently, and choosing every single day for the whole of the rest of her life to go on keeping that faith rather than letting the unfinished thing simply close itself quietly and be forgotten. She wrapped the watch back in its cloth and the letters beside it and set the box not back on its shelf in the dark room behind the ticket office, but on the small table in the front room, near the good chair, where she found she wanted it to remain a while longer, close at hand, unresolved, waiting. The weeks that followed carried Eleanor further into the daybooks than she had yet gone, past the volume that had first drawn her in and into several more beside it. And she noticed, reading on through the years her aunt had recorded, that the entries touching on Edward, though never naming him directly after that first difficult season, appeared at odd, unpredictable intervals across every single volume that followed. A note some autumn about a particular slant of light on the platform that reminded her, she had written, of something she preferred not to elaborate on. A note some spring about the roses coming in especially fine, and a private wish, unspoken to anyone else, that someone specific might have been there to see them. A note, years and years later, in a hand grown steadier and calmer with age, observing simply that some absences settle over a long enough life into something closer to companionship than grief, present in a room the way a familiar chair is present, comfortable rather than sorrowful, simply there. Eleanor understood, reading these scattered entries across so many years, that her aunt had never spoken openly of Edward to anyone in the village, not to Thomas's predecessor, not to Constance, not even, it seemed, to the vicar, who for all his gentle perceptiveness had clearly never been given the fuller version of the story, only ever the general impression of a woman who paid unusually close attention to ordinary things. And Eleanor found she understood this reticence too, in a way she had not fully expected to, understanding that some keepings are meant to be private even while other keepings, the tagged gloves, the tin whistle, the shawl left behind by the young widow, are meant to be at least partially shared, laid open for whoever comes looking, and that her aunt had drawn a careful, deliberate line between the two kinds of keeping, the public room of small lost things and the private, single vigil kept for one particular loss that had never quite become lost property in the ordinary sense at all. because no one had ever come to claim it. And yet it had never, in all those years, been discarded either. She found, working further back into the very earliest of the daybooks, entries from the season immediately following the news of Edward, and these were unlike any of the others she had read, shorter than even the earliest, most halting entries, some days no more than a single line. The weather noted, and nothing else. As though her aunt had forced herself to keep the habit of writing even when she had, for the time being, nothing in her to say beyond the bare fact of a day having passed. One entry from this stretch read only, "Cold again." The fire caught slowly, and Eleanor understood, reading it, that this single flat observation carried within it a far larger weight than its plain words let on. A young woman going through the motions of an ordinary task, because the motions themselves, however hollow they felt in that season, were the only structure left standing to hold her upright. Slowly, across the entries that followed, month upon month, Eleanor watched her aunt's writing lengthen again, watched the observations grow gradually fuller and more careful once more, a swallow returning early, one spring noted with something closer to her old attentiveness. A hard frost described again in the fuller, more considered language of someone finding her way back toward the habit of truly looking at the world rather than simply enduring it. And Eleanor understood that she was watching, in these pages, the slow architecture of a recovery that had never announced itself as a recovery. No dramatic turning point, no single entry declaring that grief had lifted, only a patient, incremental return to attention, page by page, season by season, until the woman writing these later entries had become, once again, someone capable of noticing the particular quality of frost on two different sides of a platform and finding the noticing worth setting down. There was one entry, further on still, written perhaps a decade after the earliest grieving pages, that Eleanor read more than once, in which her aunt observed that she had, that particular morning, laughed out loud at something a passenger said and had been surprised by her own laughter. Surprised that it had come so easily and so completely, and had thought, walking back to the waiting room afterward, that she did not feel any guilt at the ease of it, only a kind of grateful astonishment that a life could go on, holding both an old, carefully tended sorrow and an ordinary, unclouded capacity for present joy, the two of them settled comfortably alongside each other rather than one crowding out the other. The way, she had written, two different plants might share a single bed of soil without either one choking the other's growth, each simply making room. The season turned properly toward winter, as Eleanor read on through these later volumes, the last of the leaves coming down from the trees along the lane, the frost thickening most mornings on the platform edge, requiring her to be out earlier than ever with her broom to clear it before the first train's passengers arrived, and she found, doing this work through the deepening cold, that she had settled fully now into the rhythm her aunt must have known so well across so many winters of her own. The particular satisfaction of a fire caught quickly on a hard morning, the particular quiet of a platform under frost before the day's first noise arrived to disturb it. The sky still dark some mornings when she came out to lay the fire, stars visible above the black shape of the hills, the whole world holding its breath before the business of the day began. Thomas remarked, one such morning, standing with his own hands wrapped around a mug of the tea Eleanor had made, that the room behind the ticket office had begun to feel different lately, though he could not quite say how. And Eleanor, surprising herself a little with how readily the words came, told him some small part of what she had found in the box. Not all of it, not Edward's name nor the particular contents of the letters, which felt still too much her aunt's private matter to share in full, even with someone as gentle and trustworthy as Thomas had proven himself to be, but enough. A sense of an old, unfinished vigil her aunt had kept faithfully across her whole life, and Thomas nodded slowly at this, in the manner of a man for whom a great many small, unexplained things about a woman he had worked alongside for years were suddenly arranging themselves into a clearer, gentler shape, and said only that it did not surprise him in the least, that he had always thought there was something in the way her aunt kept that room that went beyond simple duty, and that he was glad, in a way he found difficult to put into fuller words, that the reason had finally found someone willing to carry it a little further. Thomas remarked, one such morning, standing with his own hands wrapped around a mug of the tea Eleanor had made, that the room behind the ticket office had begun to feel different lately, though he could not quite say how, and Eleanor, surprising herself a little with how readily the words came, told him some small part of what she had found in the box. Not all of it, not Edward's name nor the particular contents of the letters, which felt still too much her aunt's private matter to share in full, even with someone as gentle and trustworthy as Thomas had proven himself to be, but enough. A sense of an old, unfinished vigil her aunt had kept faithfully across her whole life, and Thomas nodded slowly at this, in the manner of a man for whom a great many small, unexplained things about a woman he had worked alongside for years were suddenly arranging themselves into a clearer, gentler shape, and said only that it did not surprise him in the least, that he had always thought there was something in the way her aunt kept that room that went beyond simple duty, and that he was glad, in a way he found difficult to put into fuller words, that the reason had finally found someone willing to carry it a little further. Constance, too, when Eleanor mentioned to her one cold, bright morning, sitting together on the platform bench, with their hands wrapped around their own cups of tea, that she had found something in the lost property room that had taught her a good deal about her aunt. She had not previously known, only smiled, in a manner Eleanor found difficult to read at first, a smile that seemed to hold more understanding in it than Eleanor had expected, and said, after a moment, that she had wondered once or twice across all their years of sitting on this same bench together, whether there was not some particular reason her old friend kept this platform with quite so much devoted, unhurried care, some reason beyond simple duty or simple habit, though she had never once asked outright. Feeling, she said, that a friend's private reasons were a friend's own business to share or not share, as she saw fit, and that she had been content all these years to let her friend keep whatever she was keeping without ever needing the fuller explanation of it. Eleanor asked her gently whether she wanted to know now, and Constance considered this for a long moment, looking out down the empty line toward wherever the next train would eventually come from, and said, in the end, that she thought she would like to know only as much as Eleanor felt was right to tell her, that she had lived long enough to understand that some stories are meant to be handed on whole, and some are meant to be handed on only in careful pieces, and that she trusted Eleanor, having clearly given the matter some careful thought herself, to have already worked out which kind of story this one was. Eleanor told her, then, a version of it not very much fuller than the one she had given Thomas, and Constance listened with her eyes on the empty line the whole while, And when Eleanor had finished, she said only, after a considerable silence, that it explained a great deal, and that she was glad, deeply glad, that her old friend had not had to carry the whole of that particular keeping entirely alone in her own private thoughts for the whole of her life, even if none of the rest of them had known precisely what it was they were failing to ask about. The two women sat a while longer after that in the particular comfortable silence that had become their custom over so many shared mornings, watching the frost on the platform edge begin, by imperceptible degrees, to lift under the strengthening light. And when the first train of the day finally came into view far down the line, its whistle carrying thin and clear across the cold air, Constance rose from the bench in her usual unhurried way and said only that she supposed she ought to be getting on, the way she always said it, and walked back down the lane toward her cottage, exactly as she had walked back down that same lane on so many thousands of ordinary mornings before this one. And Eleanor watched her go, and then turned back to the waiting room, where the fire wanted tending and the urn wanted filling, and the whole small sufficient business of the day was, as it always was, waiting patiently for her attention. Eleanor began, in the weeks that followed, to take on the keeping of the room, in a fuller sense than she had at first intended, not simply reading through what was already there, but continuing the practice itself, tagging, in her own hand now, the occasional item that still, even now, found its way into lost property. A glove left on a bench, a book forgotten in the rush of an arriving train, and she found herself writing on these new tags with a care she recognized a little wryly as an echo of her aunt's own careful hand, though the words themselves were entirely her own. A small attempt to carry forward, not the handwriting itself, but the spirit behind it, the belief that even the smallest, most ordinary lost thing deserved a moment's honest attention before it was set upon its shelf to wait. She found, doing this, that certain items asked more of her than others. A small toy left behind by a child who had wept, briefly and inconsolably, at some fear of the train itself before being comforted and boarding it anyway, asked for a gentler line than a misplaced umbrella ever could. And she took her time with these, sitting some evenings with a single new tag for the better part of an hour, trying out different phrasings in the margin of her own notebook before committing the final version to the small paper label itself, wanting, in each case, to get the tone exactly right, brief but not careless, warm but not overwrought, the same careful balance she had come, through months of reading her aunt's own tags, to recognize as the particular hallmark of the room's whole long tradition. She wrote, too, in a new daybook of her own, purchased from the same stationer in the town that had supplied her aunt's plain-covered volumes for so many years, beginning her own entries with the same halting, uncertain brevity she had noticed in her aunt's earliest pages. Weather and trains and little else, though she suspected, writing these first entries, that her own record would lengthen and deepen in its own time exactly the way her aunt's had. Given enough seasons to grow into itself, the winter deepened further as these weeks passed, bringing with it a hard frost that silvered the whole platform overnight, in exactly the way her aunt had once described. And Eleanor found herself standing at the platform's edge one particularly cold morning, broom in hand, watching her own breath cloud in front of her, in the pale early light, and thinking, without any great drama attached to the thought, simply that she understood now, in her body as much as in her mind, what her aunt had meant by finding something worth setting down in even the smallest, most ordinary occurrences, because she was, in this very moment, feeling exactly that, a frost worth noticing, a morning worth keeping some small record of, even though nothing remarkable was happening in it at all beyond the simple, sufficient fact of a new day arriving over a small station in a small village at the quiet edge of a line that ran, patiently and without hurry, toward whatever came next. It was on a morning not very much later, the frost still thick on the ground, though the worst of the winter had begun, by small degrees, to loosen its hold, that a stranger stepped down from the early train, an older man, perhaps in his middle years, carrying himself with the particular hesitance of someone arriving somewhere he had thought about for a long time, but never actually visited. And he stood for a moment on the platform looking about him in a manner that caught Eleanor's attention immediately. Not the ordinary look of a passenger getting his bearings, but something more searching, more deliberate, as though he were comparing what he saw in front of him against some picture he had carried in his mind for a very long while. He approached the waiting room slowly, and Eleanor, who was inside laying the morning fire, looked up as he entered, and he asked her, with a careful, slightly apologetic formality, whether this station had, by any chance, kept any kind of record of passengers from a good many years back, explaining, as he settled onto the bench nearest the stove, that he had come across some old family letters recently, sorting through a great-uncle's effects, that mentioned this particular station by name and a woman who had kept it, and that he had felt, reading them, an urge he could not entirely explain to come and see the place for himself. Though he held out very little real hope, he admitted that anything so ordinary as a waiting-room bench could still connect him, after all this time, to whatever his great-uncle Edward had once known here. He told her, while she busied herself for a moment longer with the fire, gathering her own composure before she answered him properly, that he had almost not made the journey at all, that the letters had turned up almost by accident among a great deal of other family paper he had been sorting through for reasons entirely unrelated to Edward, mostly concerning a dispute over an old piece of land that no longer mattered very much to anyone, and that he had very nearly set the letters aside unread, being, he admitted with a small, rueful smile, not a great one for old correspondence as a rule, and that something, he could not say precisely what, had made him read them through properly instead, and that once he had read them he had found he could not simply file them away again without first coming to see whether any trace at all of the place they described still remained. Eleanor felt the whole room settle very still around her at the sound of that name, and she did not answer at once, only asked him, gently, to wait a moment, and went out to the cottage and returned with the box and set it on the small table before him, and told him, as simply and as gently as she could manage, the whole of what she had found within it, the watch, the letters, the single page in her aunt's own hand, explaining why she had kept them, and she watched the man's face change slowly as he listened, moving from polite curiosity through something closer to astonishment and then, by degrees, into a quiet, private grief that he did not try very hard to hide. And when she had finished, he sat for a long while, simply looking at the box, unopened again now, on the table between them, before he reached out and lifted the lid himself, and drew out the watch, and turned it over in his hands exactly the way Eleanor had turned it over herself that first Sunday evening, reading the engraving inside by the grey morning light. Coming through the waiting-room window, he asked her, Once he had read the inscription for himself, whether she thought his great-uncle had known, in that last winter, how faithfully he would go on being remembered here, and Eleanor said she could not answer that with any certainty, but that she thought it mattered rather less what he had known at the time than what had actually come to pass in the years since, that a promise kept faithfully for the better part of a century by a woman who had every reasonable excuse to set it aside and never did, was its own kind of answer to the question, regardless of what Edward himself had or had not been able to imagine. Standing on some distant field in that hard season, about the shape his memory would eventually take in a small waiting room he might never have pictured in quite this much careful detail. He told her, once he had recovered himself enough to speak again, that his great-uncle Edward had indeed not returned from that hard winter and uncertain spring, that the family had known this for the whole of his own lifetime, a fact folded so early into his understanding of his own family history that it had never carried, for him, the sharper edges of a fresh loss, only the softer, more distant weight of an old family sorrow. Present but settled, the way old sorrows become, over enough generations, part of the general shape of a family rather than any single wound within it. He said that he had never known, until reading those recently discovered letters, that there had been a young woman at all, let alone one who had kept, across the whole span of her own long life, a promise made to a young man who had never been able to keep his half of it. And he said, turning the watch over once more in his hands, that he did not entirely have words yet for what it meant to him to sit here, on this ordinary platform bench, holding the very object his great-uncle had once entrusted for safekeeping, kept faithfully by a stranger to his family for the better part of a century, out of nothing more than the simple, sufficient conviction that some things are owed a keeping regardless of whether anyone ever comes to claim them. They sat together a good while longer, the fire between them drawing well now, the first ordinary passengers of the morning beginning to drift into the waiting room and settle onto the other benches, and Eleanor found herself telling him, in bits and pieces as they occurred to her, some of the smaller details from the letters themselves. The joke about the tea urn, the delayed train that had stranded Edward for an afternoon and left him watching her aunt move about the room with what he had called, in his own words, the art of an ordinary task, well done, and the man listened to each of these small recovered fragments with a quiet, growing tenderness, saying, at one point, that he thought he would remember this particular morning, sitting in this particular waiting room, for the whole of the rest of his own life, regardless of anything else that came of it, simply for the gift of having been handed these small, previously unknown pieces of a great-uncle he had otherwise known only as a name on a family tree and a date carved into a stone he had visited as a boy, without ever quite understanding what it meant. Eleanor told him, then, of her aunt's own written wish, that the watch be kept rather than simply handed over the moment anyone came asking, kept in whatever way felt right, and she asked him, gently, what he thought would feel right now, given everything, and he considered this for a long while, turning the watch over one final time, before he said that he thought, on balance, he would like the watch to remain here, at the station, if she was willing to go on keeping it, because, it seemed to him, sitting in this small, warm waiting room, with the fire drawing well and the frost outside beginning at last to lift under the strengthening morning light, that the watch had found across all these years, exactly the right kind of keeping, and that it would feel wrong. Somehow, to remove it now to a drawer in his own house in a town it had never known, when it could remain here instead, close to the platform his great-uncle had once meant to return to, in the care of whoever came, generation after generation, to keep this particular small station running. He left the letters with her too, in the end, saying only that he thought his great-uncle would have wanted them read by someone who understood, properly, what they meant, and that he trusted her, having heard the whole story from her own mouth just now, to be exactly that someone, and he took, before he left to catch his return train later that same day, only a single small thing for himself, a photograph Eleanor found, tucked among the cottage's own effects, of the platform as it had looked in her aunt's early years. Roses newly planted along a fence, not yet grown high, a young woman standing beside them whom Eleanor recognized, with a small ache as her aunt at an age she had never herself seen her reach. And the man accepted this photograph with a careful, grateful reverence and said he would keep it somewhere he could see it often, so that his own family's memory of Edward might, from now on, include not only the sorrow of his not returning, but the fuller, gentler knowledge of what and whom he had left behind here. Waiting, he asked, before he finally rose to go, whether he might write to her occasionally, not to press the matter further or to ask anything more of her than she had already so generously given, but simply to let her know, from time to time, how the photograph and the story it carried had settled into his own family's understanding of themselves. And Eleanor said she would like that very much, and gave him the cottage's address written out in her own hand on a scrap of paper torn from her notebook, and he folded it carefully into his coat pocket, in almost exactly the manner she noticed with a small private smile, that a person folds something they intend to keep rather than something they expect to discard. He lingered a moment longer on the platform before his train arrived, standing near the rose bed where the photograph had been taken so many years before, looking down the line in the same searching manner he had first stepped down with that morning, though the searching in his face now seemed satisfied rather than uncertain. A man who had come looking for a trace of something and had found, instead of a trace, a whole small, vivid history he had not known to hope for. And when his train finally drew in, he shook Eleanor's hand warmly, thanked her once more, and boarded it. And Eleanor stood at the platform's edge, watching, until the last carriage had disappeared around the bend in the line, feeling, as she watched it go, the particular quiet satisfaction of having been able to give someone something they had not known, arriving that morning, that they were even looking for. Eleanor watched his train pull away down the line later that afternoon, standing at the platform's edge in the pale, strengthening light of a winter beginning. At last, to loosen towards spring, and she felt, watching it go, a settling in her chest that she recognized as something close to completion, though not the kind of completion that closes a story off entirely, more the kind that allows a story to rest for a while, its most pressing question finally answered, even as the larger, quieter keeping of it continued exactly as it always had, unbroken by the answering, simply enriched by it. She returned to the room behind the ticket office that evening and set the watch back in its box, on its shelf, in its proper place among the gloves and buttons and the single carved bird, and she wrote a new tag for it, in her own hand now, brief, the way her aunt's earliest tags had been brief, kept, at the family's own wish, in memory of a promise once made, and, in every way that mattered, ultimately kept. And she tied this new tag on beside the old one, not replacing it, but adding to it a small, visible record of how the story had grown one further chapter, without ever needing its earlier chapters erased. The rest of that winter passed quietly, the frost lifting by slow degrees into a damp, mild stretch of weather that Eleanor understood, from her aunt's daybooks, to be entirely ordinary for this part of the country at this turn of the season. And she found herself, through these final cold weeks, settling ever more fully into the life she had, almost without deciding to, chosen for herself. The fire laid each morning, the urn filled, the platform swept, the garden's bare stems inspected daily now, for the first hopeful signs of the growth that would come, in its own unhurried time, once the days lengthened properly towards spring. Constance came most fine mornings still to sit on her bench and watch the trains. And Eleanor found herself, some mornings, sitting beside her for a few quiet minutes before the day's work called her back to the waiting room, the two of them saying very little, needing to say very little, simply sharing the particular comfortable silence of two people who understand a place well enough between them that conversation has become, most of the time, an unnecessary addition rather than a requirement. Thomas continued in his own steady way, opening the ticket office each morning, closing it each evening, and Eleanor understood, watching him go about these small, unremarkable duties, that the station itself, quite apart from any single person who kept it, had its own patient continuity that ran deeper than any one keeper's lifetime, that it had been kept before her aunt by others whose names she did not know, and would be kept after herself by others she could not yet imagine, and that her own part in it, however long it lasted, was simply the current stretch of a much longer, much quieter continuing. She thought, some evenings, sitting by the fire in the good chair that had been her aunt's, and that she now thought of, without any strangeness at all, as her own, of all the small, ordinary threads that had gathered themselves together to bring her to this particular understanding. The solicitor's letter folded soft in her coat pocket on that first journey, the glove and the tin whistle and the shawl, the daybooks filling steadily with foxes and frost and small unremarked kindnesses, the box kept faithfully for however many years it took for someone, at last, to come asking. And she understood that she had become, somewhere across these quiet weeks, not simply the inheritor of a cottage and a garden and a room full of other people's small lost things, but the newest voice in a very long, very patient conversation that had been running along this platform for the whole of her aunt's life, and, before that, for however long the station itself had stood here, waiting for whichever train was next. Spring arrived. In the end, the way it always arrives in that part of the country. Not all at once, but in small, accumulating installments, a single early flower pushing up along the fence where Eleanor had not expected anything so soon. The first tentative return of birdsong in the mornings, the light lengthening by slow degrees at both ends of the day, until the fire no longer needed laying quite so early nor banking quite so carefully at night. She noticed the change first in the quality of the air itself, a certain softness to the mornings that had not been there through the hardest weeks of winter, the frost giving way most days now to a damp, mild haze that lifted slowly as the sun climbed. And she noticed it, too, in the behavior of the passengers who came through the station, a certain looseness in their shoulders a willingness to linger a moment longer on the platform than the cold had allowed, to remark to one another on the turning of the season with the particular pleasure people take in noticing, together, a change they have all been quietly waiting for. Thomas mentioned, one such morning, that he always thought the platform seemed to breathe out properly for the first time each year on the first genuinely mild morning, as though the whole structure of it, stone and iron and timber, had been holding some part of itself tight through the cold months and could only now, with the sun actually warming the platform stones underfoot, allow itself to loosen. Eleanor spent the first properly warm afternoon of that new season working in the garden, clearing the last of winter's dead growth, turning the soil along the bed where the roses would come again in their own time. And she found herself thinking, as she worked, of her aunt doing exactly this same work in this exact same soil across the whole span of her own long life, season after season, without any expectation beyond the simple, sufficient certainty that the roses would come again if the ground was properly prepared for them, and that this preparing, this patient tending of ground, whose flowering lay still some months in the future, was itself a kind of faith, quieter than any spoken creed, but no less real for its quietness. She worked steadily through that whole first mild afternoon, clearing dead stems from the rose bed, turning the darker soil beneath, where the lavender would come again, once the last risk of a hard frost had properly passed. And she found her hands remembering, in a manner that surprised her, small details of technique she did not recall consciously learning, the particular angle at which to cut back a rose cane so that new growth would come outward rather than inward, the depth at which to turn soil so as to loosen it without disturbing whatever roots already slept beneath the surface waiting for their own season, and, she understood, working this way, hands moving almost of their own accustomed will, that some of what her aunt had known had passed to her not through any single lesson, but through the accumulated, unremarked observation of a childhood spent in small visits and short stays, watching this same garden being tended by the same careful hands, knowledge absorbed sideways, the way a person absorbs the shape of a language they grew up hearing, spoken around them long before they could properly speak it themselves. She thought, too, working through that long, mild afternoon, of the letters still resting in their box on the shelf behind the ticket office, of the young man who had once promised to show her aunt a stretch of coast he loved, the grey-green water, the particular sound of it against the shingle, a promise that had never been kept in the way it was meant to be kept. And she found herself wondering whether her aunt had ever gone to see that coast on her own. In later years, whether she had stood on some grey afternoon looking out at exactly the water Edward had described in his letters, carrying his description with her the way a person carries any promise that outlives the one who made it, turning it by the simple act of finally going to see the thing for herself into something completed after all, even if completed alone, and in a manner entirely different from how it had first been imagined. She resolved, turning this thought over as she worked the last of the soil, that she would go and see that coast herself before the year was very much further along, not out of any need to resolve anything further in the story, which felt, in its essential shape, already as resolved as it was ever likely to be, but simply because she found she wanted to see it, wanted to stand where her aunt might once have stood, wanted to hear for herself the particular sound. A young man, in a letter written a very long time ago, had thought a particular young woman would love more than almost anything. She stood at the end of her work that afternoon, looking down the length of the platform garden, at the bare, waiting beds, and the first small green shoots already pushing through here and there, at the waiting room with its stove banked low now that the worst of the cold had passed, at the ticket office where Thomas was closing up for the evening, at the whole small, ordinary, entirely sufficient world her aunt had spent a lifetime keeping, and that Eleanor now understood, standing there in the softening spring light with dirt still under her fingernails, to be as fully her own, to keep as it had ever been anyone's, not because she had earned it through any single dramatic act, but because she had simply gone on showing up for it, morning after morning, fire after fire, cup of tea after cup of tea, until the keeping of it had become, without her ever quite noticing the moment it happened, who she was. She thought, too, standing there in the last of that day's light, of the whole long chain of keepers this platform must have known before her aunt ever arrived to keep it, faces and names entirely lost to her now, each one laying the same fire, filling the same urn, in whatever form it had taken in their own time, tending whatever garden had grown here before this particular garden was planted. And she understood that she was not the newest link in a chain that had begun with her aunt, only the newest link in a chain whose true beginning no one living could any longer name. And that this, rather than feeling in any way diminishing, felt instead like a kind of quiet welcome into something far larger and far steadier than any single life could account for on its own. A welcome that asked nothing of her beyond a willingness to go on doing, faithfully and without fuss, whatever the next ordinary morning required. She went inside as the light finally failed, lit her own fire in the cottage grate, and sat down with her daybook to write the evening's entry, and found, picking up her pen, that the words came more easily now than they had on those first uncertain evenings. A small, steady record of an ordinary day, the first flower along the fence, the last of the winter's ash cleared from the waiting-room stove, Constance on her bench in the strengthening afternoon sun. Nothing remarkable in any of it. And yet, Eleanor found herself writing exactly the kind of ordinary worth setting down, because someone ought to trouble to remember it. And she had, somewhere in these quiet months, become the someone who troubled. She wrote, too, a shorter entry beneath the first, noting simply that she intended, before the year was much further along, to travel to the coast Edward had once described, and that she did not yet know what she would find there, or feel there, only that it seemed the right sort of thing to do. A small, private continuation of a promise that had waited a very long time already, and could, she thought, wait a little longer still, for exactly the right unhurried afternoon to be finally, gently kept. Outside, beyond the cottage window, the platform lamps came on one by one against the deepening dusk, and somewhere down the line, faint but growing steadily nearer, the sound of the evening train began to carry through the still spring air, arriving, as it always arrived, exactly when the timetable, patient and unhurried, said that it would, and Eleanor set down her pen and sat a moment longer in the firelight, listening to it come, content in the plain, sufficient knowledge that she would be there, on the platform to meet it, the fire lit, the tea ready, the whole small waiting world of Ashwick Station held, for one more evening, and however many evenings came after it, safely and faithfully in her keeping. She rose, banked the fire low rather than letting it die entirely, and walked back out along the garden path toward the platform. The evening air soft now, with the particular mildness of a spring dusk, the rose's first new leaves showing pale green along the fence in the lamplight. And she thought, walking this short, familiar distance, she had now walked so many hundreds of times since that first strange evening with her case in her hand, that she no longer felt herself to be a visitor arriving in someone else's life, nor even simply an inheritor tending someone else's legacy, but something quieter and steadier than either. A woman walking home along a path she had made entirely her own, toward a small lit station that was waiting, as it always waited, for whoever next needed its fire and its shelter and its patient, unhurried welcome. And she reached the platform just as the train's lamps came into view far down the line, and stood there in the gathering dark to meet it. The whole quiet architecture of the place settled comfortably around her. Home.